Hi, Nalini, Jay. I'm Jim Thomas. I'm here with two esteemed colleagues to talk about something I think you're bringing to the therapy world that's so essential. When I think about I could go all the way back to like Salvador Minuchin, who said that the goal of a family therapist is to expand your therapy heart so that you can take in more and more families into your heart and your sessions. And that core skill of like EFT that we're trying to attune to as much of our clients' experience as possible at all these multiple levels, including the parts that are really difficult to carry for them and need to be shared, and not just the parts that are comfortable to me that I can relate to with ease. And I think this is what you guys are both all about. So I'm wondering if you could put your work, just give us a brief description and put it in the larger context for therapists who are working with emotionally focused therapy and similar models that value relationship, attachment, emotion, and vulnerability. Um, Maybe would you start, Nalini?
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for having us here. We're really excited to be here. One of the things that we learn in EFT is that we're kind of shifting between different system levels, right? We're within the person and then between the couple. As we start to integrate some of these bigger concepts, we see that there's actually other system levels that we aren't attending to, that we haven't attended to in our trainings or in the teachings of EFT so far. And what Jay and I attempt to do is show that actually the skills that we have can actually be expanded to use at these other system levels if we also bring in culture and context and difference into the framework. And that's really what the framework that Jay and I are creating is about, how to do that effectively.
What drew you both to this? Like personally, professionally, um, tell me a little bit about how you came to that, like expanding the EFT and systems framework out in this way.
Sue Johnson is very fond of saying that EFT is what would have happened if Carl Rogers, the father of humanism, and Sal Minuchin sat down for tea with John Bowlby, right? Family therapy, humanism, and the founder of attachment. And so part of our conceptual idea was what would have happened had Sal Minuchin, Carl Rogers, and John Bowlby, and maybe Sue Johnson sat down with Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Thich Nhat Hanh, Cesar Chavez, and like how might the model have developed in this direction naturally from the beginning? And so I think that's our conceptual frame for what we are doing, what we're about. I mean, we're both in interracial marriages, and we're both in families that are multicultural. And so I think for me, when I started, thank God we had a couples therapy with a non-EFT therapist that was not helping us set a date for our wedding. Thank God we found an EFT couples therapist who did help us set a date for our wedding back many years ago now. But the conversations around culture and context and the system and the ways in which we get treated differently in the world were just always there. So it was always part of how I learned EFT as part of my relationship. And I don't think I realized for a while that it wasn't part of what other people were talking about in their EFT therapies. And then it's been a process of trying to figure out conceptually, like, how does that fit in?
Can you say, what do you mean by that? Like unpack that a little bit. It wasn't what other EFT therapists were talking about. This is key. I think this is I see you're nodding your
Well,
head too.
yeah, let me tell a story. In 2003, my husband was in a awkward position at work, a bit of a power struggle with somebody at work. And I assumed that, like, we both were more or less equal and that he could do the things I could do. So I recommended to him, with some help, I think, from a white therapist, that I was helping support my husband to be more assertive, to claim his power, to take his place, but coming from what I would call a view of the world that I have because I am a fairly privileged, educated, middle-class, white male. And, I'm very vocal, I'm very extroverted. So I was assuming that he had all the privilege that I have. My view of the world was that he would be able to do the things in the world that I can do. And then he did. and he ran headlong into all kinds of stereotypes that my husband is a Malay Muslim immigrant from Singapore. So he ran headlong into all kinds of stereotypes that Asians should be humble and submissive, and it did not go well. And so that was in a non-EFT therapy where we just didn't have the language to talk about what had happened, and that basically I had set him up to fail, and he was holding some anger that he couldn't really figure out how to express towards me because we couldn't articulate what was happening. When we began soon after that in EFT therapy, it was possible to talk about, wait a minute, I thought that the world would treat you the way the world treats me, right? And I did you a disservice by assuming that, because we already know that that's not true in other contexts, right? And so we were able to do some repair work, and my husband was able to forgive me for what had happened. And also there was some growth, because a similar, even more troublesome event, power struggle at work, happened in 2014. And although there were some dicey bits in that case, he was able to roll with what was happening and recognize what was happening. So eventually he ended up being promoted into the job of the person that was, I would say, having somewhat of a bias, was messing with him. And he ended up with her job. So it's like a way in which there were hurts and traumas and disconnections, and then later opportunities for growth and healing and repair that we were enlisting by our ability to differentiate what was me, what was him, what was the world, where were our expectations in that, and how do we bring that all together to help us in the work of supporting each other and not getting into cycles.
Okay. Similar for you, Nalini?
Yeah, I similar to Jay, but I would say, like, Jay will say, and he said in our other trainings, this is something that he came into as an adult. He wasn't as aware of this until he entered into this relationship. And I also believe, Maya Angelou's quote, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better, right? Jay's like, he didn't learn this until later, right? I learned it as a kid. Like, I saw it around me, right? I saw the way racism and sexism impacted my parents' relationship. I saw the way the cultural differences between us as kids born here and my parents born in India. I saw the way that we couldn't connect. It created a lot of conflict. We didn't know how to have conversations about the difference. And I saw kind of how that would turn into cycles, right? What we call in EFT cycles. But they were not just about our relationship, right? They were about the context of the world in which we lived. And as a kid, I didn't understand why my parents were pushing me so hard. Now, as an adult, I realize it's because they know that I live in a world that's going to not see my skills at the same level as someone else who's white male especially. I do have to work harder. And my parents were trying to instill that in me in a way that they didn't know how to directly name with me. But as an adult now, I can contextualize it and realize part of the reason they were pushing me is because they knew that I was going to struggle in a way that I didn't even know at the time, right?
So I kind of hear your stories. It's how people are like sort of nested and attached out in the world, or insecurely attached, experiencing lack of acceptance. You need to like gender and stereotype threat. Why isn't your partner being submissive? That's what we expect from Asian Americans. Your parents not knowing how to articulate, we're putting all this pressure on you because we want you to survive in this hostile world out there.
Right.
And it coming in and impacting, Jay, your relationship with your partner. You're talking about, not only it's impacting me and my parents and how close we could be when I was younger, because I didn't understand, why are you so tough, or why is yeah. So you're bringing this then.
That and the piece around the clinical work, it's around attunement, right? When I was working with system involved families where the kids were system involved and their families, when we think about attunement, we have to actually attune not just to their emotional experience, but the context in which they're living, right? It's like, if a lot of people who work with system involved youth, and the ones that I worked with were a lot of Black and brown youth, I would have to actually contextualize that the world is harder on them because they're Black and brown, especially male, but not exclusively. And that they didn't get to be kids the way that white male youth got to be kids. And that's part of why their parents are terrified. It's not because you're bad. It's because you don't get to make mistakes your mistakes are more costly for you. And it's not fair, but that's why your parents are so scared. Right. And not saying that as a clinician means you're missing a big part of what the family is actually struggling with. Right. The impossible situation they're in, that they have to actually navigate it as a family, but there's often so much fear and normal adolescent autonomy happening that they can't quite connect around that, right?
Wow.
And when we miss that as clinicians, we're actually not able to help in quite the same way. We can kind of create a story as to what's going on that's not real, that's not really based in their experience.
Right, and then that might lead to that. The research, it shows when we're working across culture, the tendency to pathologize, put attributions onto behaviors, come in with a psychological theory to try to explain something that's a very real human struggle with racism, sexism, oppression, marginalization, and things. And you're talking about naming it and bringing it forward in the room. Can you guys say a little bit more about, like, I love this idea that what you're saying is that if we're trained in EFT, for example, there's already a big skill set. It's like I think this is part of what's sort of invigorating and liberating about this idea, as I understand it, is bring that skill set to these differences and struggles that people have that come in and impact relationships and might impact the relationship with you, right?
Yeah. Jay really loves talking about this, so I'm going to pass it to Jay.
Well, thanks.
So lit up.
I mean, just think about a family like Nalini just mentioned, where it's not just cross-culturally that we attribute and tend to pathologize. Like, it's also cross-generation. It's also on each other. It's when we're not clear that the reason, if I'm hard on my kids and the reason is I'm terrified that they're going to be treated differently for something that's beyond their control, and that's never made clear, right? Think of all the negative cycles that will erupt as my kids just think I'm cruel, as I think that they're failing, right? And the power of what's essentially an EFT reframe to say, oh, I get it. It's not that the kids are failing. It's not that you're cruel. I mean, we can talk about ways to promote success and do this differently, but it's your fear that the system's going to treat them differently. That's what's causing the problem here. And then to be able to turn to each member of the family and talk about that. And, what's it like to hear that, to think about that, to consider that. That's basically an EFT reframe. But instead of reframing at the interpersonal level of the negative cycle that we often reframe in EFT, it's a reframe of the system itself.
Right. Bringing that systems lens in and more comprehensively and holistically, like, to do you have some understanding of where this family exists in the larger world?
Right.
When dad goes off to work, what's that experience for dad? Does dad get to go to work as, most of the time in my work, I get to be Jim Thomas, and I don't deal a lot with, people saying, why aren't you being something else? I'm a member of the dominant group, right? And what's it like for mom? How did they end up in this situation and these struggles? You're talking about the larger picture.
And I think that just like we could reframe at the system level, our other EFT interventions, we can conjecture, we can validate, we can normalize. We're very used to doing that at the individual and the interpersonal level. But then there are other levels of the system. Right? Nalini, would you feel comfortable to share that incredible story of the subgroup level that you have?
Yeah, I will actually, because I think it frames exactly the thing you were talking about, Jim, that sense of like, when I go to work, I get to be me. And it kind of speaks to how the systemic and the context sort of plays out in relationships. Jay mentioned that I'm in a multicultural relationship, multiracial relationship. My partner is Mexican American. I'm Indian American, so my parents are from India. But we had a moment where he was a very high level executive at a Hispanic media company, multi-billion-dollar company. But in his company, you would see actually at the top, really, you would only get so high if you were brown. Basically all the C-level, for sure, board members, all white, even the general managers were white. He was one of the few people that got to the general sales manager, general manager level, that was Hispanic. And then like at the time, the only one that was Mexican American versus like Cuban or South American, which is a whole other anti-Indigenous sort of pull that like a lot of Mexican and Central American people feel even within the Latinx community. So he was in this, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
He was in this
Okay.
situation where he was behind closed doors with a bunch of white men who had power over him. And they were all there. He was the only Mexican American person. And they started to joke about the women in the office in really, I think, gross, objectifying ways. In fact, I started to feel really gross and disgusted when he was telling me this. Because I was starting to get triggered, I didn't really notice his discomfort as he was sharing it. I just heard what he said.
Mm.
And I said, how did you respond? Right? Like, I'm wondering, did you let them just say this stuff about women in front of you? Right? That's what I'm thinking, because I'm starting to wonder about his response. Is he my ally? Is he on my team? Does he understand what it's like to be a woman in the world? Like, the women in his office are not that different than me. I have worked in corporate America, and the idea that men go behind closed doors and objectify and demean women is not that far from my experience, right?
Mm.
And so I start to ask him, like, how did you respond? And I see him tense up, and he kind of shares, like, I didn't really say anything. I kind of made a joke. I kind of just like, kind of laughed it off. And then I started to really get mad, right? In that moment, because I have a raw spot as a woman of feeling demeaned, objectified, devalued, reduced to my physical appearances. That is a very common experience of women globally, actually.
Right.
And in that moment, he was one of them.
Yeah.
I was us and he was them. He wasn't my partner in the moment. He was just he was like, it was a betrayal, right? He was not my partner anymore. He was a man.
Yeah, that's what happens in cycles.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. That would be like on the subgroup level, right? That then I view of us and view of them got triggered in the moment. But I also, and the thing that makes this so complex is in that moment, because I was so triggered by my raw spot, I failed to see his position in the room with the white men.
Yeah.
And that he was in his own view of us, view of them, and relational sort of behavioral pattern with them, where he kind of withdrew or made good, because not doing that could threaten his job, right? Because that's actually the reality of like the context. It's not about feelings. It's about his job could be threatened. If he says, hey guys, it's kind of not cool that we're doing this. These people work with us and they're human. Doesn't make me feel good, right? As a Mexican American man, to say that in a room of white men who have a lot of power over you, it's a job threat. But in that moment where I was so triggered, Jim,
Yeah.
not thinking about that, I was like, who are you right now? What? How could I have married you? Like, all this really intense anger and betrayal and hurt came up for me, and I couldn't,
Yeah, as you describe it, I said what I think that if I was in the room and doing therapy and Jay's over there as your partner and it's you and you're describing this, that I want to be able to hold both contexts and start to hold that, like these are two people with raw spots that come from these subgroup experiences, and your raw spots are rubbing up against each other, right? He's in there feeling attacked and judged, and I was just trying to survive. And now in the moment, maybe if he's more the emotional withdrawer, he's just feeling criticized, right? And I could get lost in that, and I could go, and that's important. I would want to work at that level. But I think what you're teaching us is, I also want to zoom out and say, help me understand your silence. You were in a room with white men at your job that's very important to you. What was your dilemma? You had an emotional, relational dilemma in that moment of speaking up. What are you learning? And help both of you with those raw spots by going in and trying to, you were saying earlier, Jay, like conjecture and validation. And is there more to this story than meets the eye if I just look at it at the micro level?
Well, that, and you're starting to show how these different system levels intertwine and relate, right? It's like
Mm.
in that moment where he's in that room and not speaking up, there's also the fear inside him of like, I could lose my job. But then, like, what am I going to do if I go home and tell my partner I lost my job? Right?
Mm.
Like he's
That would have
literally
also not gone
in a
over
possible
well.
situation, right? It just all these different levels they play out with each other. And if we don't have the ability, like you said, as a clinician to kind of zoom out and help people see how they're related and help them create a larger framework of understanding of their experience, then we're kind of limited, right? We're really limiting them in being able to actually de-shame, to connect, to actually see each other more fully as human.
Yeah,
And many,
I had a very felt emotional response when you said limited, when we're not zooming out and at least getting curious, right? Yeah, that there's something missing, and we want that as clinicians to leave important things unexplored that are impacting. Yeah, please, Jay.
what I think not just unexplored, but to go back to the story I told where, my husband went to work and both I and his therapist had been encouraging him to be assertive and be yourself and right, all perfectly good goals that at the end, at like a, sort of view of self level, like you can do this, right? I can do this. But heedless of wait, what's the actual system like? What are the signals that are coming from the actual system? I don't think it ever got really explored, right? And so I see it as very similar as therapists, and Nalini and I are essentially trying to give people a little bit of a map for like where you go, when, and how. But if you think about the complexity, there's a validation that a therapist could give to Nalini that, right? I mean, women have this experience in the world all the time, and that experience it's because of rooms of men just like that women aren't even in. And what's that about, right? And you could validate that experience of a view of us is what we've taken to calling it, right? And at the very same time, you could validate for her partner, and meanwhile you're in this room feeling different, feeling focused upon, feeling uncomfortable, having all these different weights on you around the relationship and loyalty to your wife and et cetera, right? But also the very real sense of danger from the system, which isn't view of world. View of world is subjective. The system is a real thing, like a cycle. We can behaviorally observe that people get fired for rocking the boat in the wrong direction, especially when they're brown, right? And so that distinction between the view of world that's my husband Nalini, her partner, like the subjective experiences that are informed by our histories, view of world, totally different thing from the actual context and what it's going to do or does do or is already doing, right? It's not coincidental to this story. It's right, the data is right there that not only is Nalini's partner the only you said indigenous, I don't know what to call it, Mexican, the only Mexican American person in the room is not a coincidence. And there's no women in the room isn't a coincidence either. So the data is all there that the system is unsafe. Right, we just don't know to what degree.
So there's an important distinction what you just did, that the view of world coming from subjective experience versus, back in this dates me, I was early 90s when a colleague talked about healthy cultural suspicion, because I was working a lot with African American families, right? And it's like they're the safe position for them is to assume not to trust you and not to trust your motivations and to go and you need to learn more about the experience of a Black family, but not expect your clients to teach you that, to put that on them. And this is talking about a bigger responsibility. I think you're calling, you're saying, hey, all of us need to be able to zoom out and see these things and start looking for these things. But you're also something very interesting. You're saying sometimes we may be the one that comes in and says, and I don't know what this is like for you in this situation, like as a woman. That's what I find myself a lot speaking across gender and saying, I may be missing something in this dynamic. You sit here as identifying as a female, help me understand as you sit here with your partner, how that's impacting this relationship, how is it out there in the world for you, how it might be different than your partner. and bringing home that, how helping people bring this stuff home so they can share it with their most important person. What's it
Yeah.
like to be in that room and be the only, the Mexican indigenous person, or what's it like to be a woman in this world, etc. This is, am I kind of getting the gist of it?
Yeah, actually, the two interventions you kind of use that Jay and I call level. One is leveling. You say like, I don't necessarily know. I walk through the world differently, but I'm curious about what's going on for you. You're asking, and you're naming the context. As a woman, you walk through the world really differently, and it treats you differently. And I'm wondering how that's playing out here. You're using some of the interventions we're talking about as you're starting to expand this idea into what, from what we're saying. There's a natural propensity to take what we know and expand it to these areas where we're learning. And so I can just see that it's a natural, we hope that for other people too, when they come, when they hear what we're sharing.
I think what you're taking that name for, it's great, because with leveling, the way you just described it, like, I just can name it and start to invite conversation about it and not feel like I have to have this expertise.
Right.
And I think this holds people back. I'm going to say something wrong. I'm going to, I'm going to upset. So they pull back and ignore. We become like emotional withdrawers around context and intersectionality and difference, I think, if we're not careful, right?
And think of the expertise as an expertise in yourself, in your own experience. So I have a story that's probably relevant. I was working with a Asian American couple, and both born in the United States, and both of the same ethnicity. And I kind of, there were a couple that doesn't fight. What an EFT we would call a withdraw couple. Things went under the rug. And so sometimes in early sessions with couples that never fight, as the therapist, you're sort of wondering what we're going to talk about, and they stare at you and you stare at them, and there's a sort of awkward moment where there isn't yet the safety built to start to bring forward these things that the couple doesn't typically talk about, right? And so I rather clumsily in a session committed a microaggression by accident, and I said, I'm noticing that it's sometimes hard to decide what to talk about in the sessions this week, like last week. And I wonder if that's maybe about being Chinese American, about being Chinese. And they both immediately responded, well, we're Americans. That's not what's happening. They changed the subject. Now, it wasn't, they did not come back, and they did start talking about something else. The change of subject, but I was aware that was a real miss, because I had othered them. It was like I was normal, and they have this sort of interesting feature, like called culture, right? Or
That
conflict
and the
aversion.
implication that they're not American is something that they've heard their whole life. You're Chinese, you're not American. That's something they've heard their whole life, and now their therapist is saying that.
So double microaggression, maybe triple if you put the power dynamic on it.
Yeah.
Right. So it was not. I was aware as it was coming out, like, but it was too late. Right? But it's something that happens, right? Like, and they did come back, and so about 2 weeks later, I tried to think, how would I do this in a way that not makes them somehow like a talking unicorn with these odd features that I need to learn about, they need to teach me about, but like I'm a being with a culture and they're beings with culture. So going for the same intervention, I leveled and I said, I'm a Jewish New Yorker, and in my family, conflict was, especially direct conflict, was no big deal. Like we can kind of be direct, we can be forward, we can even be angry, like it's something our family dynamic can handle. We have other things we're not so good at, but that one is no problem at all. I'm wondering what it was like for you growing up. And then by sharing of myself and expertise of myself, but about conflict, the same couple then immediately said, oh my God, the ethnicity is not Chinese, but Chinese families are not like that. And then we spent the whole session talking about how conflict was handled in their families of origin and how that made them very reluctant to be broaching conflicts with each other, because it's now like, I have culture, you have culture, I have a way of handling conflict. How do you handle conflict? And that doesn't feel like othering. That's leveling the playing field, is what we mean by leveling. Like now we can just have a conversation.
Yeah, I will say a lot that I come with a lot of Northern European. When it comes to conflict in my family, if there was conflict, it meant like divorce or somebody's going to get killed or something, right? And I want to understand, what did you learn about conflict in your family, right? And I like what you said about it's not putting, you're over here in the non-normal, I'm in the normal, and this
You're
is,
interesting. It's as if you're
yeah,
I
interesting.
yeah,
like not normal because that's what it feels like.
Not normal.
exactly.
I'm normal, you're not. And so,
Yes, yes. Can you, maybe to draw our discussion to a close, I want people to know about this workshop series and how they can keep learning about applying EFT and what they already know as a therapist, zooming out, getting what you said about there's worldview that comes subjectively, and there's danger out there and complication and life not, and how do we get interested in that which is not already familiar to us, and go to uncomfortable places with people in order to be of better service, I think. Can you talk about your workshop series?
yeah, I also just want to say that like part of the way that Jay and I think is that, one of the things about EFT is it's so nuanced, right? We have all these interventions. We're really deliberate about everything. And so we realized that if we wanted people to grasp some of these concepts, we were going to need to develop a framework that people could look at and sink their teeth into and like assimilate and integrate. And so a lot of our work really is that we present frameworks. We help people bridge the gap between what they know and where they're growing into. And we really do believe that when we know better, we can do better. We talk about what doing better looks like, how to repair when we do microaggress or when we injure, and what attachment injury repair can look like in those moments. So that's a lot of how we think about things, and that's how we teach the material. And Jay can talk a little bit more about what we're teaching.
Well, I would add one tiny point also, that we've taught attachment as if it's just dyadic.
Mhm.
The view of self and view of other and the cycle is the whole kit and caboodle. But there's research that attachment extends far beyond the dyad. People have attachments to causes, to families. I think when those of us who are marginalized as not straight or not white or whatever part of us is marginalized, when we're scanning for danger and we have that healthy suspicion you mentioned, Jim, like that's about our attachment to the system, because we know the system's not safe.
Mhm.
Right. But so, we're trying to integrate systems and attachment in a very EFT way, but about the whole of the system and all the levels, with a lot of practice and chances to role play and learn from experience. And so if you go to our website, which is EFT-lifeline.com, EFT-lifeline.com.
Okay, EFT-lifeline.com. Okay.
Right. You'll see there we have a 12-hour training that we're offering twice this fall at least. Once will be on Friday and Saturday, October 1 and 2. And then for parents who can't take that much time off without coverage on the weekends for childcare, also for our Jewish colleagues who Friday and Saturday is sort of exactly the wrong time.
Right.
We're going to be offering it on a series of 3 mornings on 3 consecutive weeks, 4 hours per shot, October 14, 20, and 26.
Oh, I love this, and build on these ideas. Give people frameworks, is what I'm hearing. Nalini, you're saying, and I love that both of you talk about when we know better, we do better. It's got that humanistic roots of EFT.
Yeah, it's a Maya Angelou quote. It's a really great quote.
Yeah.
I also think that one more thing, and we just decided to do this. I'm very excited to say, Jay and I are also going to do a free intro. It's called Beyond. I have to make sure I get it. Beyond bring it up when it's grist for the mill isn't enough. How to bring up culture, context, and difference in the therapeutic relationship. Again, this is based on what you were saying, Jim. It's like when we don't know how to do it, we sort of freeze and we kind of withdraw because we don't want to harm people. But then we realize withdrawing is also can be harmful, right? Because when we don't see or attune, we're actually missing a huge part of the client's experience. And so we wanted to just present kind of this intro. We teach a framework of how to start doing these things and these interventions, gives people a chance to get to know Jay and I and how we teach. And hopefully if they like what they see, they can continue on to sign up for our larger training.
We'll put the link and all that info on when we post this. And I just really appreciate both of you and what you're doing together, what you're bringing to the EFT world. I think it's we're hungry for it. We need the bigger lens and the bridging and melding of these two, you know, the dyadic experience, and then how's that experience being impacted by the larger world, and seeing that through an attachment lens. And you get reminding us we already have a lot of these skills, and we know better, we do better. It's wonderful stuff. So thank
Jim,
you.
my connection hiccuped there for a second, so I don't know if it came across, but the date for the
Oh, I didn't say it. Yeah, September 10th.
Beyond, just bring it up. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you, Jay.
We're targeting September 10th at a lunchtime slot Pacific time, so that even our Jewish colleagues on the East Coast could attend before the Shabbat begins.
Okay, September 10th, noon Pacific time. So we'll have all that up there. Thank you again for your time. And yes,
I just want to say one last word. Thank you, Jim. I just appreciate how embodied you are. I see you going on a journey with us, and I feel like you taking it in and meeting us, and like I just feel really touched sitting with you. So thank you. I really feel you.
Thanks. I've just learned so much, even just in this conversation, and what could we hope for more as therapists, to have bigger hearts?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Grinch's heart grew 3 times that day. Could we all have that happen? So, all right. Thank you. Until next time, maybe we'll have a follow-up conversation.